Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me and giving me the time to introduce the topic of night work in and around organizations. So I'm a senior lecturer at Lund University, Department of Business Administration. I've worked on this topic now for 3, 4, 5 years, but I had some heavy teaching, so I'm starting up again. The good news is I, together with 2 colleagues from CBS, we recently got funding to work about this topic. So I'm hoping that we can do much more than we did or I did so far. In this talk, I will go into 3 different topics, or different, they hang together, of course. So first, ontological questions around night, then a short historical overview of night work, and I highlight results from an empirical study into night work in 2 different settings. So before we start with the ontological question, just a little bit about my field. I'm working in organization studies, which is an interdisciplinary field based on management theory, but also sociology, psychology. So it's really an interesting field. And I read Crary's book on the 24/7 capitalist society. And he says we're now as a society constantly in low power readiness. So because we consume and work and do whatever activities around the clock. Night work has become increasingly normalized. According to Eurostat, which is the European Union Statistics Division, night work is defined as work done at usual sleeping hours. The member states have different labor laws about that, but usually it's around 11 p.m. to 4 a.m. That's kind of like the core part of the night. And the night, as you all know, poses a conceptual contrast and difference today. This seems so mundane and normal, but it is actually not. And it is also not in organizations. And we will see about that. So basically in organization studies, working, managing, organizing, resisting, and all these concepts that are so central to our field are usually described as daytime phenomena. So day is always the norm and night is always the deviance. So basically we don't know very much about night work except in occupational medicine. There we know a lot. We know that there are numerous detrimental bodily, mental, and social effects of night work for the night workers. So disturbed sleep-wake patterns, different forms of cancer, cardiovascular diseases like diabetes. It's even studies describe depression or dementia as being correlated to night work. And I found a study on the lower life expectancy of night workers. So there is quite a mounting body of work showing that night work is not a great idea for the body, at least, and the mind. However, we also find people that love it. So there is always some variation in there. But yeah, taken together, we're missing out a little bit on looking what goes on in organizations at night if we just always look what's going on during the day, right? So I found that there was not a lot on, or nothing about night work in my field, and I started to get more and more interested. So when I first got interested, I started also to think of myself, what is night? What is the ontological being of night? And I couldn't really answer this question. I went to more traditional ideas of ontology, and it is not easy to answer what night actually is, right? So some would say it is a set of physical phenomena. It's a periodic absence of sunlight. It is darkness. There's lower temperatures. It impacts our bodies. So our circadian rhythms, our internal clocks of the body. And circadian rhythms is both an individual and collective phenomenon, right? We all might have very different circadian rhythms, but we all have them, and they're all tied to day and night in some ways. They may vary based on geographical location, seasons, age, and so on, but we all have one. So there is a kind of link to night. Then it's also a set of cultural ideas and practices. So it's also a societal or social phenomenon. Daytime business is rest. We have certain rituals that we only do at night. We have this time of introspection where we reflect on our lives, maybe. We have some free time, which Rancière describes in his book, Proletarian Nights. We have also this connotation of night is the time for resistance under the cover of darkness. We sleep at night, but also drinking, crime, romance, whatever is usually tied to night, which doesn't mean it does not occur in daytime, but it is kind of like in our thinking tied to night. It's also a metaphor for primitive times, for example, or a discursive context for invisibility, criminal actions, transgressions, and all those things. Now, when I tried to find out how can we then think of what the night is, I found some help in new materialism, which is a school of thought that comes up, I think, in humanities and so on. And so I particularly looked at Karen Barad's ideas. And she says any level of investigation should be phenomena or interactions and not things. So things would indicate a separate pre-existing entities that interact with each other, versus when she starts with phenomena, we see that they're always intrinsically intertwined, and only our focus on certain parts of these phenomena make them into separate entities. And I found that very helpful for understanding night, because we could naively say night is periodic absence of daylight and sunlight, and we can watch it from space. But typically we don't watch it from space, right? We are always interacting with night, and there's no way we cannot interact with it. So basically, we can only know the being of something, of night, through our entanglement with it. So there is no distinction between ontology and epistemology in this regard. So we do not merely observe night, but we experience it and thus become part of our own understanding of night and day. And we experience it in various ways, right? Physiologically, with our bodies, mentally, culturally, even emotionally, night really impacts us, and we experience it in various ways. Based on these ideas of new materialism, I then tried to describe night as time-space, based on sociologists that, for example, Massey, that talk about time and space as inseparably intertwined. And typically we think of time as conceptual and space as material, right? But with new materialism, we can shake things up. We can say time is material because it impacts our material bodies in certain ways. And we can also say time is night is conceptual space. And there is, Lefebvre writes about nighttime spaces, which means there is a physical space, let's say a corner in a city, and then night comes and sweeps over this physical space, and the rules change. So for example, the daytime prohibitions fall away, and it is a corner where prostitution is occurring or happening. And then a day, the rules kind of set in again. But I think night is that and more. It is a conceptual space, a mental space in our heads. Think about a nighttime district that also works in night mode in summer when the sun comes up early, right? It still continues till, I don't know, 9, 10 to work in night mode. Or think of, I found a paper on Inuit in Alaska where the Arctic night that lasts several weeks, where they still have a mental concept of the construction of night and day. So they still distinguish, even though there's just darkness and no sunlight at all, or hardly any at least. So we can actually turn these things around. And what do we get with this? So what we get is we can see these various forms of entanglements of us with night. And then we see lots of attempts to manage and control them. So this material time, we could see biopolitical techniques described by Foucault. So biopolitics is his term. And I'll go into this in the next slide. And we also see conceptual space with attempts to manage resistance, deviance, otherness, and things like that, both in society, but also in organizations. Now let's talk just a little bit about biopolitical techniques. So Foucault says in the 20th century, human bodies became part of a new apparatus of power, in addition to disciplinary power. And he calls them biopolitical techniques. And with night and night work, we see lots of ideas of how can we make night work more tolerable for those that have to work it, right? But at the same time, it's also how can we make it better justifiable, despite all the detrimental effects on the body we have just talked about earlier. So there is a lot of medical research on night work, like what types of shift models work better for the workers, and what artificial lighting is better for their alertness, for, I don't know, prevention of accidents and so on. There is also something that Williams calls pharmaceuticalization of sleep and wakefulness. So the sales of over-the-counter sleeping pills is going up and up. People have more and more trouble with sleeping. This might only be partially due to night work, but it is maybe a symptom of a society that has normalized night work and consuming and working during the night, the same as in the day. There's also a lot of sleep research going on, and Williams even calls it politics of sleep. There is even socioeconomic studies saying that the wealthier you are, the more hours of uninterrupted and regular sleep you will have. So maybe not the amount of hours will differ, but uninterrupted and regular sleep. Now coming to the second part, which is the conceptual space and attempts to manage these ideas of or connotations of resistance, deviance, and otherness. In organizations, we will see that in the empirical part, but also in society, we see that, right? That there is different behaviors in cities, for example, or at night. There are different people around at night. There are sometimes semi-regulated zones of night work for immigrants, for example, or people that for some reasons do not make it to enter the more regulated daytime market in terms of work. So they just end up in the night, which also makes for different people. There's also specific jobs tied to night, bouncers, for example, or sex workers, which predominantly, I think, work at night. We also have this wonderful book and paper of Melvin, who compares night to a frontier, to the US frontier. So the frontier between a densely populated area and then a hardly or sparsely populated area. And he says the frontier, as it was in the US, shows similar or some similarities to night. For example, fewer people, different people, more friendliness, but also maybe more violence, different laws and rules, and so on. And I think that analogy is quite inspiring, to think of night as a frontier. I also sometimes think of night as the upside down. I don't know if you watch Stranger Things, but it is a little bit like the upside down in my head as well. Now we come to a short historical overview of night work, because I think it's always good to know where do we come from in terms of history, and how does this play out in the current day, right? So how have these entanglements or interactions shaped our experiences with night, and what social norms and behaviors in previous centuries were shaped by them? So here I take a lot of insight on board from, I don't know how to pronounce him, Ekirch, I think, his book on At Day's Close, Night in Past Times, and Kozlowski's Evening's Empire, A History of the Night in Early Modern Europe. And when I read those books and thought about night work more particularly, I thought it is really attempts to control multiple dimensions of night and fit them into a capitalist success story, at least in our Western industrialized countries. So basically the night became from something sacred and dangerous to mundane and ordinary. It turned from event time to clock time. Now, event time is a more a time basically where events can be longer or short. So the experience of time is not necessarily quite regular, as we know from clock time. And clock time is fungible time. 1 hour is like the other, right? An hour of night shift is like an hour of day shift. It's just the same. You can just, switch them. And the third, from sleeping to working and consuming. So whereas in previous decades and centuries, there was a clear boundary between day and night, our societies have now kind of blurred boundaries. There is no real, it's a mere suggestion of a lifestyle to sleep at night and work at days. So the three phases, I think, that I found from the book is that, and I kind of ordered it in this way. So in medieval times, the night was dangerous and secret. So people would not voluntarily go out into the night, because it was pitch dark, especially moonless nights, and was really dangerous. And they thought that supernatural creatures would, I don't know, be out there in the dark. Religious and town authorities forbid night work at that time for religious and safety reasons. Religious reasons were that the night is there for introspection and reflection on your relationship to God. And safety reasons were you only had candlelight, which impacted on the quality of the product, but also on, yeah, it could easily lead to fires, and then a whole part of the city would burn down. So it was actually forbidden and discouraged. Later, a little bit, Rancière in his book Proletarian Nights describes so-called worker intellectuals, which means that people started to realize, oh, I have some hours in the night that are just mine. I can write, I can read, I can do paint or something. And this is my private time, where they were not having to work in wherever, in the first factories, for example. The next phase is the illuminated night, both metaphorically and literally. Metaphorically, enlightenment is the very metaphor that kind of shows how the light of reason comes into the darkness of superstition, and religious authorities kind of have a fading influence there. I found very interesting that there's different jurisdictions were around for day and night. So while, for example, an intruder in the night, if you killed him or her, you were not punished as severely as if the same thing would have happened during the day. Why? Because at night you could not have seen if it was just a thief or a murderer, whereas during the day you could have seen it. And the first public lighting comes up. It's described 1660 to 1700s in the major European cities, but it was with whale oil and coal gas, so it's far away from what we consider street lighting these days. And it was only parts of the city, and it was, yeah, more or less effective, I would say, reading up on these matters. And then we have industrialized night. So Thomas Edison's electric light bulb in 1880 really was a precondition for industrialization. We read in Marx Capital about the lengthening of the working day that is inherent in the capitalist system. So the exploitation of the labor power during all hours of the day. And the only limitation, he says, is the weak body of the worker. In this time or era, that factories came up in Europe. The first I think I read was 1770 in the UK somewhere, a silk mill. But after electric lighting, there was really factories grew all over Europe. And we see also that there was this invention of a job. Today, jobs are kind of normal, but back in the day, it was so that typically the work and the person were one. But now the idea was, okay, so we describe a certain tasks, and then different people can do these tasks at different parts of the day and night. So the idea of a job came up, and also shift schedules, where whole families then started to live around the schedules of their family members, which was a big change for many families and society as such. So today then, if we kind of just bring this to the contemporary night, we see that it is very much normalized. We see that insomnia is a pressing problem in all societies, at least in the West. Probably have seen these retreats for managers so that they learn again to sleep in some uninterrupted hours, or there are holiday packages where you can learn to sleep again, and so on. And the three main influences for night work and for our 24/7 capitalist society, as Crary says, it's the capitalist system still, it's globalization, where now we work seamlessly across different time zones, and IT as a means to order and consume all around the clock. Now, coming from this historical part to the empirical questions I had. So I did an empirical case study of night work in 2 different organizations. I did interviews, so it's qualitative empirical study. I did interviews with around 50 something workers in a steel processing factory. And I also interviewed people in a medical laboratory and tried to see what is going on at night there and how do they experience night and what can we see. And the themes that appeared during the interviews in both sides were physical and mental exhaustion. Well, that was not such a surprise, but how they described it was really interesting. Feeling like a zombie, it's cruel, it's brutal. So they had quite interesting terms for their physical and mental exhaustion, and also disruptions of their social life. But they also mentioned feelings of autonomy, which kind of made me interested in these feelings of autonomy, and I wanted to know more about that. But first, I show you something, a little bit about the, first the feelings of autonomy. They're related to power and control and employee agency. These are all very central concepts in my field. And it would be too much now to go more into control, for example, in organizations. But let's just keep it what there are some direct forms of control. Behavioral control through watching, the most basic form of control. And then there are more indirect forms like output control, where you're not interested in the behavior, but you just want to see the results. And or surveillance via software could be something that is more indirect compared to watching people work. We also have various forms of peer control. We have informal and formal peer control. We have management designed, but also worker designed peer control. And what I was interested in here were informal and unspoken group norms that were the basis of peer control. So people were watching each other, what they were doing at night and so on. Control, however, always includes agency. Either in the form of consent. Consent means really working hard. So Burroway, for example, studied or asked the question, why are people working so hard as they often do? Which is an interesting question. So consent, he says, which means really working hard, can be an escape from monotonous work, or it can be an escape from subordination, in that you feel proud of yourself as a hard worker. But consent, also resistance is one way of or form of agency. And resistance can have very different forms. It could be individual, collective, it could be very blatant and open and rather covert and subtle. Yeah, from strike to cynicism, everything could be subsumed under forms of resistance. And here, my interest was deviant behaviors that I saw at night and forms of escape that they showed at night. Okay, so these were the ingredients, and let's see about the 2 research sites to give you a little bit more context. So this was a laboratory in a hospital, and they worked, so during days it was probably around 30, 40 people in various different labs with different specializations. And at night, there was just one person handling the emergency part. So for example, a blood sample matching and crossing for transfusions and so. And they were working alone. What else can I tell you about this? Yeah, let's leave it at that. And we have the next one. It was a steel processing factory with several production halls. It was a very dangerous environment, and accidents happen quite often, I was told. And so here, of course, the whole work teams were around at night. They had 3 shifts, which means there was a early morning shift, let's say from 5 to 2 in the afternoon. Then there was an afternoon shift from 2 to, I don't know, early evening, and then the night shift. And as a worker, you would usually have, let's say, 1 week of morning, then 1 week of afternoon, and then 1 or 2 weeks of night shifts. And that was their schedules. Of course, the changes of the shifts itself made it difficult, but from all 3 shifts, the night shift was, of course, the most burdensome for most. There were some that really liked it, even after 30 years. They said it's the best thing ever, but most really had problems with it, ranging from mild problems to severe bodily problems. That I found, alarming, but they didn't seem to find alarming. What I found then was that there were changes, or they had very specific personal experiences. So this extreme physical and mental strain, they mentioned exhaustion, fatigue, even after the shifts. So it's not just during the night shift, but the days after and the weeks of the night shift generally was very hard to bear for many of them. And while they said, yes, you have more time for the family during the day, for your kids, for example, you see them more, right? But you're out of it. You can't really fully interact with them because you're just tired and exhausted and hanging on the sofa, and you have no motivation to get up and really do something with them. So it was a kind of mixed feeling of having time for the family. They felt out of sync with society, so they said you can't be part of a club or an association or do some regular sports with some other people, because these changing shifts, and especially the night shift, would intervene with that. Those that engage in sports said they realized that after a night shift or in the night shift weeks, they shouldn't go do sports because it's just not really working for them. And also the social life becomes difficult. I heard a lot about divorces and strain with the family and so on. And all these things together led to changes of group norms, especially the extreme physical and mental strain, because they had this thinking of, okay, we are here at night. It's an extreme environment or situation, let's call it that. And so we can do things a bit differently here. And they developed a kind of live and let live solidarity. So if you watched someone doing something that was not allowed, you would never tell, because you thought, okay, I probably also do something that is not allowed during the day or would not be tolerated. So they had this, okay, I see it, but yeah, it's okay because I'm doing it as well. What kind of different behaviors are we talking about? Just to give you an idea, they were constantly watched during the day by the supervisors, and now they were not watched, and they could read a newspaper while the machine was running smoothly. They could have an additional break or whatever. They could play around with their phones if everything was running smoothly. And interestingly enough, the management told me that performance at night was at least as good as day, if not even a bit better. But they felt really more autonomous, they said the atmosphere is more relaxed. You feel free from the daytime pressures and management scrutiny. The other changes were workplace changes at night. So there were fewer people. Not all working teams were there. Then the management was absent. They did not do night shifts. So that meant control became more indirect. So it was more software based and it was more oral accounts. And that was also very indirect because the manager would come, or the supervisor would come at 7 in the morning. They would talk to the morning shift, and the morning shift had talked to the actual night shift. So they would have it via two different sets or groups of people what occurred at night, or if something specific occurred at night. And software-based means that they could look up in every machine's software. Did it run through the night? Were there stops? Was there something that was entered into the logbook or something? And so, yeah, they would check on these things in the morning. And these things made people feel more relaxed. So there were these feelings of freedom and autonomy. I then saw what I describe as nocturnal mindset. So mindset is basically a sense-making framework. It's cognitive filters for absorbing and processing information. And we have individual mindsets and collective ones, and they kind of interact with each other. And nocturnal mindsets were now based on these changes of the workplace and their personal bodily and mental experiences. And they justified and invited more relaxed interpretations of daytime rules and allowed members to resort to deviant behaviors. Even some managers actually said, yeah, well, what can you do? It's kind of human to, do a little bit different at night. Only the plant manager was not agreeing with this. He said, no, it's not right. We pay them for night shift and they get extra pay. So no, I don't see that there should be any deviations from work at night to work at day. So basically, this is just a visualization. We have the workplace changes here. No management, indirect control, relaxed atmosphere, which leads to feelings of autonomy and freedom. We have this mental and physical strain, and then changes of informal group norms. And then we have these deviant behaviors, which again then inform nocturnal mindsets. So they kind of reinforce each other over time. So basically what I saw was they tried to escape into the night. So escape could be a form or is a form of resistance, but that's not taking on control or managerial power head on, but it's more a sideways move, right? You're diving around it. So they tried to escape into the night and get rid of managerial scrutiny and being watched all the time and the daytime pressures. So daytime pressures could be visitors in the factory halls, the testing of new products and things like that, which only happened during days. But at the same time, when the physical burden was too big for them, the bodily burdens, they also had to escape from the night through deviant behaviors, additional breaks, reading something, maybe even falling asleep, like here in the picture, either involuntarily, you just kind of fall asleep, or maybe you go to a toilet and stay there for a little while the machine is running smoothly, or you checked with a colleague and said, could you check my machine, and so on and so forth. So basically, I saw this mixture of consent, working very hard. I found that as well, to escape monotony, and also these forms of resistance where they did these deviant behaviors. And I think this was an interesting, in both cases, by the way, I was talking now just about the factory, but I found similar things in the laboratory, where also controls became more indirect, where also they could do a little bit different. There was not much space to do things fully differently, but a little bit. There's always a little bit leeway, I would say. So taking all things together, the three parts that I had, the ontological questions and the new materialism ideas, then the historical views of night work, and also the empirical case. What, if we bring all those things together, what does that mean? I think nighttime space is increasingly contested. So the private time is more and more, it kind of becomes colonized, commercialized, the pharmaceuticalization of sleep. Many, I think, need to take sleeping pills to be able to sleep at some point. So these are all, things that we see in society. We need, I think, more socioeconomic studies to see how people in different strata of society deal with night, and how sleep, for example, works out for them, how work is for the different parts of society. And we also need to know a little bit more about night work and the pandemic. I saw that some other people in this network have talked about the pandemic and the night. But I think also when it comes to the focus on work and night, the pandemic is interesting. Many people started to work from home, but when you have small children, you probably could not do this during the day, and many then worked at night. And so I think there was, quite big shifts of working at night in or during the pandemic, when people were more flexible in the hours of the day that they would use to work. I think that was the things that I wanted to present from my work so far. I hope to have more results in some time when the project is going on. But I'm looking forward to any questions.